Someone asked me about it. Look, I do have a lot that I want to get through, so I need to be careful and not try and speak too fast or bore you to tears. I've given talks before here, you know, over the years since, well, when I was here and since then. And indeed, whenever the last one was, a bit more than a year ago, I think, I also talked about some of this material, which is then talked about identity and the role of identity in being a person or the self. Now, I'm going to start with that again, but I want to get through that part relatively quickly because I've been, in recent times, thinking about some other topics which I'm trying to link in particular the concept of narrative, of seeing ourselves in a sort of narrative context, and how that might connect to the concept of dialogue, which I spent a lot of time thinking about, and how in turn, bringing those two things together might offer some prospects for responding to a world which has gone a bit crazy. And I'll try and explain some of that. But we need to start with the concept of identity, because what I want to do is say why I think the concept of identity turns out to be a red herring. In other words, it's there, but in fact it's very straightforward what identity is. And once we understand that, then all of the talk, and a lot of it happens in the media and it comes in the social sciences, about identity theories, about the politics of identity, about constructing our own identities. Personally, I think that, well, not personally, I think that that is in fact all garbage, and I'm going to, in the confines of this small group, be rather, you know, blunt, and it's been a distraction and it can cause confusion. So let me try and say why. So let's start with the question. I've got to do this, I have an automatic thing which I've got to do. Well, let's start with the question, let's do that. Okay, who might ask this question? Who am I? Well, the first one is a kind of trivial one, where someone may literally not know who they were, right? An amnesiac or something like that. Now, I do have a joke about this, but I don't have time to tell it, so I might tell it later. But, these are the trivial cases. You also would use that in a third-person case a little less trivially. So, oh, who is, you know, Mark Mason, by the way? Oh, that's him there. Or who is that person over there? Well, that's Mark Mason. So those kind of trivial cases. But there's a more interesting case that's being talked about in philosophy and other social sciences. Someone quotes searching for their identity. And that's the phrase I sort of want to look at for a little while. Or having what some philosophers, for example, the eminent philosopher Charles Taylor has written about, people having an identity crisis. And of course in psychology, people have talked about this thing. What does that mean? Well, they already know who they are in a trivial sense, right? Telling someone, oh, by the way, you know, don't worry, you're so-and-so, that's not going to help someone having a so-called identity crisis. But what does that actually come down to? Well, let's have a look. It could mean at least these two things. The first one is, it's what I have in common, right? Who am I? The answer to that question, what I have in common with some others and what distinguishes me from others. So it's who or what I identify with. That's what we might call the common view outside of analytic philosophy. And it's wrong in terms of being a definition of actual identity. And I'll try and explain why. The second sense of who am I is what is it that distinguishes me from everything else, my unique identity. And that's where analytic philosophy has answered that question, or tried to. And I think that's the right answer, but it doesn't take us very far. So let's look. Now I've got a number of slides, and I'm not going to try to discuss each one, don't worry, where I've got quotes from various sources, newspapers, textbooks and so on, talking about this notion of the first concept. Identity is what you have in common with others. You identify with others, or you identify as Australian, or as Caucasian, or as male, or as whatever. As Christian, or all of those things. So here are a number of possibilities, and I've bolded some text which I think is kind of interesting and speaks to what I want to say. Social identity, the second paragraph. Social identity is a person's sense of who they are based on their group membership. The individual's very conception of self, blah, 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 is to do with their constructed social groups. The contemporary use of identity to refer to such features of people as their race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, religion, so on and so forth. That comes from actually a very eminent philosopher who I have a lot of respect for, Anthony Appiah, at Princeton. Oh, now he's now at NYU, I think. But I think it's still a confusion. So philosophers also are part of this. People may see their identity as defined partly by some moral or spiritual commitment, say as a Catholic or an anarchist, blah, 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 or Quebecois. This is Charles Taylor, another eminent philosopher. This situation, okay, I've got a few more down the bottom. To know who you are is to be oriented in moral space. I think that's true, but let's keep going. My own identity is seen as constructed, fragmented, shifting, impermanent, pluralistic, non-unified and conflicted. Others see the self as multiple, fragmented and unfinished. And down the bottom, finally, with the advent of the postmodern period, there's the culprit. Right? The central outlook in social and political thought has shifted to a view of the self as flexible, fractured, fragmented, decentered and brittle. Well, thank you very much, postmodern period. I'll explain in a second where this is coming from. The self became the postmodern subject, conceptualised as having no fixed essential or permanent identity. Identity becomes a movable feast. Down the bottom, individuals derive identity or understanding of self in great part from the social categories to which they belong. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to impress you with how much stuff I've read. Okay. And Appia most recently wrote an article in the New York Times where he said, among other things, that middle paragraph. Because members, he was talking about, when I express my opinion, am I always expressing it as a so-and-so? Or speaking as a Christian, speaking as a gay person, speaking as a whatever American. And he says, no, because being a member of one identity group doesn't mean that we're not members of others. So we're not all the same because we belong to many identity groups. Now he's right, we're not all the same, but not for that reason. We're not the same because we're not the same person, we're different people. Right? So, I'm just nervous about not wanting to spend too much time here. Okay, oh, no, I'll leave that one. It's more of the same, more or less. Now, okay, so this is me, right? I attempt to identify myself and others qualitatively. That's what this has been all about so far. When I say qualitatively, I mean in terms of qualities or properties that I have. I am a so-and-so, and I identify with other so-and-sos, right? One of them or many of them, so you can put them all together if you like, or put a lot of them together. However, I at the same time yearn for an answer to the original question, who am I? Which specifies what makes me uniquely me. After all, why would someone searching for their own identity be satisfied with being grouped with others? I mean, intuitively I just find that strange. You want to know who you are and you're told, well, you're with this group and you're with that group and you're with that group, but that's not right. Now, from that point we could go off in a number of misleading directions. We could say, well, maybe I am not just this or that quality, maybe I am the sum total of my qualities. Now, philosophers, certainly in the analytic and empirical tradition, know where that kind of view leads. It doesn't lead in very attractive directions. Again, I'm not going to try and say why. But you see, what's going on here is that these people I've cited, and what I'll call the social science view, which has adopted a broad postmodernist perspective, is saying, look, when you think about the fact that we, all of us, are members of different groups, we come and we move out of them, we move into them, we identify with this today and that tomorrow. When you think about all that sort of shifting, there's a whole kaleidoscope of things. Since this defines the self, then the self, I, am also a shifting, changeable, brittle, blah, blah, blah entity. And I just think that inference is mistaken. And in fact, well, I will explain this, so I don't want to sort of dwell on it. Okay, here's what I want to say about what I'm calling the postmodernist view. The postmodernist view of the self has spawned an entire epistemology built around subjectivity and moral relativism. Now, many postmodernists would say, yes, that's what we have been talking about. Once the subject is absorbed into his or her qualities, so from a logical point of view, you've got the I, or the subject on the left, and then I am so-and-so, and all these qualities on the right. Once you lose track of the subject and think, well, the subject is defined purely by its predicates or by its qualities, that is a fundamental logical error. And it was only recently, fairly recently in logic, worked out, because logic developed in the late 19th century, to make a fundamental distinction between the subject term and all of its predicates. But once you ignore that distinction and try and define something only in terms of its predicates or qualities, the idea of objective truth disappears. There is no objective me to be known, therefore there is no objective truth to be known by us. So this, I think, came from a rejection of an Enlightenment view of the self. The self, Descartes' idea, the self was this incredibly important entity that somehow stood outside of the world, so outside of its own qualities, and it was somehow in control of everything. So in reaction to that, a lot of people, as I'm calling loosely and generally postmodernists, brought the self back into the world and absorbed the self into its own qualities. Now, that may not sound very clear, so I don't want, we'll see it as we're going on if I need to say more about that. Contemporary logic rejects the dichotomy of what I'm calling qualitative absorption on the one hand, but also this self, this I, which somehow stands outside of its qualities. I don't know whether you've ever thought about this, but philosophically, you can say to students, think about a sentence like, I am this, and think of all the things you can fill in there. Right? Now, you could ask them, well, are you in fact simply reduced to all of these things? There's no you except that you're the sum of all these things. Or are you somehow separate from them? So there's an I, a being, behind all of these qualities and properties. Well, that's going to lead to trouble as well. It's like peeling an onion and expecting if you keep peeling it, you will find, there's the essential onion right down there. Well, of course, that doesn't happen. You just peel and peel until there's nothing left, right? Both of those views are wrong. And in logic does, I think, have this right. Let me see. I'm going to talk briefly about what I think is the correct sense of identity in the context of who am I. That expression of identity, what distinguishes me from everyone else, that is my unique identity, that's, I believe, the way to proceed. It's what some philosophers, including David Wiggins, who was one of my mentors and who's written very extensively from analytic philosophy on the subject of identity. Interestingly, Wiggins, among other analytic philosophers of the last 100 years or so, when they write about identity, they never even think about the kind of identity that I've just been talking about that comes from the social sciences and a lot of postmodernist philosophers. Conversely, all of those writers never even think about the analytic concept of identity. And I believe that I was the first person to point out that there are these two different ways to talk about identity. But anyway, I could be wrong about that. Now, Wiggins, funnily enough, says, kind of ironic, number two, that is my unique identity, or a thing that makes it what it is. It's not just persons, it can be this bottle is identical to itself, right? Is a quantitative or strict or numerical identity. He calls it absolute, determinate, irreducible, and all or nothing. Now, contrast that with what postmodernist writers were talking about in the previous slides, right? Identity is this shifting, unstable, brittle, changing, whatever. Because they're talking about two different things. My uniqueness is quantitative, not qualitative. Qualitative means it's about the various properties and qualities I have. In terms of quantity, I'm just one person. Now, let me give you a couple of quick examples. I've talked about some of these before. My favourite is the old photo example, okay? So, forgive me if you've heard it. I show you a photo of my third grade class from many years ago. And I ask you, could you please find me in that photograph, right? Now, a photo of me, right? And of course, you may or may not succeed, okay? Now, it is true that in looking for me there, you will use qualitative cues or clues. There's nothing else you can use. You can't go back in time and find me in that. You have to rely on sort of qualitative features. But that's misleading, because I'm not asking you which person in that photograph is qualitatively like me, in other words, looks like me. I'm asking which person in that photo is me. And that's a very different point. He is literally me. And not only that, but he's literally me despite all the changes that have occurred, because there have been a few from when I was 8 to now. Physically, intellectually, blah, 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 And indeed, it goes further than that. If you didn't have a concept of the self, of the person who has survived all of those things, and it's still literally me, then all of those qualitative changes wouldn't make sense, right? If you couldn't talk about that individual as me, then the fact that that individual has undergone all these qualitative changes, it wouldn't be very interesting if it wasn't me. So qualitative change depends upon an individual that is still identical through that whole period. And that's what I think analytic philosophy gets clear, and as far as I can tell, no one else does. Let me give another example, because I think it's more topical and more interesting. I read, not long ago, a case of a transgender person who I think was a woman and now is a man, and his family, his mother were kind of concerned, And he said to her, "Don't worry, Mum, I'm still me, it's still me." And that was exactly right. Right? So he changed his most fundamental qualities, if you think about it, right? Changing from being a woman to a man is pretty fundamental, qualitatively. But he is the one who changed, or she, that doesn't matter. It's that person who changed in all those ways. Just like refugees who are forced out of their homes, flee their country, undergo massive qualitative disruption if they do survive. But if they're going to tell their story, it's a story about them, numerically identical people, who undergo all those changes and come out of it at the other end still them. It's not interesting if it's someone else, right? That point, the more I think about that, the more I read about it, strikes me as so obvious that I'm amazed that in the popular mind, in the media, and as I said, in the social sciences, that's not the way people talk about identity. Okay, so, Bill, there's a bit more I could say about this in a logical sense, but I'm not sure that I want to do that because it'll distract us from what I want to get into. Down the bottom there, Wiggins talks about each individual thing. Or maybe I could say this because it's a kind of philosophical point. The point I'm making is that no number of qualities, as in properties of things, will uniquely identify an object, right? So the qualities are important. You have to know what kind of thing you're talking about. A bottle, a person or human being, we won't get into that, right? If we can be identified as living or existing things, sorry, don't even have to be living, because this has its identity as well, then there must be some concept of that thing which it falls under. And whatever that concept is, if it's a person or human being or bottle or implement or something, then that concept provides what Wiggins and others call an identity criterion. So you need to know what kind of thing you're talking about. And when you know that, you'll know how to trace an object through its entire life. So from its beginning, through its life, or through its being, to when it gets destroyed. But that concept, let's just say for us it's human beings. Let's say that's our fundamental kind. Knowing that we're all human beings will not identify us, because we're all human beings. So, you know, you might say, well, I need to know more, which one is me? Add in some more qualities. Well, like I say, I'm the Australian who's visiting Hong Kong. That might work in a sort of contingent sense, but philosophically or conceptually it doesn't work, it's misleading. You cannot specify an individual purely qualitatively. You need something perceptual or something experiential as well as something qualitative. Now, philosophers since Kant have known about this. Kant's whole philosophy, as I understand it, is built on the idea that you have both a conceptual component to knowledge and a perceptual component. You have to not only know what kind of thing, the categories, if you like, the concepts, you have to have a sense of this thing being an object in space and time. So that's what Wiggins called a this such. If you want to pick something out, you have to pick it out. And you can't do that qualitatively. You have to point to it, or you have to take it and say, this thing, this person. There's no way of getting around that. And that's not something that, I think that's something which analytic philosophers have realized, but it's not very well understood. I know I'm being a bit arrogant about analytic philosophy, but anyway. All right, once we realize that the answer to who am I is not given by reference to my various identity groups, because that's what I'm saying. That's not the answer to the question. We can transcend the boundaries imposed by those groups in search of a more fundamental concept that binds us. The thing is, you see, having now said I think the concept of identity that really works is the one that defines me uniquely, and I'm saying, well, I am a person, which one? Well, this one. When you think about it, that's not very useful, right? I think it's strictly correct, but it's like saying, well, A is A, right? And so my little conclusion about that is that the concept of identity that's been talked about by all those others is misleading and confusing. And the other concept that I think is strict identity is logically correct but useless. It's not going to help solve any of those big social, questions about who am I, what's my destiny, what's my whatever. So I say a little bit about this here. Am I going too far? I'm talking fast, I know that, sorry, but is it okay? Do you want me to start again? Today I want to talk about identity. So let's come back to this question, who am I? Second paragraph. Insofar as we make our lives, not only as men and women, gay and straight, Ghanaians and Americans, I'm borrowing from some of those previous writers, blacks and whites, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, Jews, Muslims and atheists, members of the family, blah, 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 Catholics, Americans, so on. We do so because we are all persons in the world. So I think the concept of person is a kind of broad concept here that's what people are really looking for. This does not specify or identify or define our identity, it assumes it. Given that I, this individual, am self-consciously a person in the world, so what? How should I live my life? What do I stand for? What really matters to me? If this is what people like Taylor think of as the identity questions, right? The struggle for identity, that's fine. But I don't think it's a struggle for literal identity. I think it assumes that I already know who I am, thank you very much. Now I, this person, am going to ask these questions because these are important questions. Indeed, I use a really profound term here and describe them as the big questions. And of course, sometimes philosophers like to think that they are raising the big questions. It's not our qualitative associations. I'm kind of sad, I think this is like repeating, but all right. Here we leave identity behind and turn to the normative or the ethical, if you like, requirements of personhood, which have nothing to do with the normative requirements of so-called identity groups. See, that idea that we, or each of us, are somehow identified by our relationship with this group or that group, one of the problems with it is that these groups have moral attachments or requirements or normative, and people have somehow thought, well, they must be things that apply to me. I must have to do this because I'm a member of that group. Just like saying, well, part of my identity comes from being this. And people will say, well, what does it really mean to be Australian, to be American, to be Brazilian? And they say, well, there must be some, and so you find politicians saying things like, wow, in Australia there's mateship, and there's camaraderie, and there's a sense of fairness, and a lot of countries do this, right? And I would say, yes, they're really noble things. In fact, I would say that they are important for all persons. They may have special contexts, right? What is it that makes me Australian? I was born there. Boring, but true. Or I might have been, nationalised. I might have become a citizen. They're the things that make you Australian. There's nothing else, as it were, that underlies one being Australian or one being indeed anything else. I see personhood as providing the framework for an answer to who am I, but not via identity. I'm not saying being a person will give you your identity, because clearly we're all persons, so that's not going to be very helpful to give us our unique identity. And by the way, in brackets, I've said a person is a member of some identity-bearing kind. I'm not going to talk about that. As long as we all belong to a kind, it may not be the same kind of thing. For example, that I wouldn't talk about, just a quick example. A Martian, Ditharani, right? Or indeed a computer, or maybe some intelligent animals like dolphins. On my view, they could turn out to be persons. Certain qualities which I think they have. But we're going to be of different kinds, different empirical kinds of things. So we might have different identity criteria. But so a person can span different kinds. But that's not what I really want to talk about. And the important question here is, who is this person in relation to others? And that's partly what I think is important about persons. That we are, each of us, what I call one among others. So what does make me a person? Well, here are some features. So what I'm saying is, okay, let's assume we know what kind of thing I am. Let's assume we know what specifies my unique identity so that I can follow myself through time, like in the photo. But what makes me a person? Now this, of course, is itself an old question in philosophy, and more recently other disciplines. I do think that there are certain features which are fairly well accepted, and I mean, each deserves some discussion, but first of all, and I think it is first in a sense, intuitively, persons are self-aware. We're aware of ourselves. Right? It's self-conscious, self-aware. I think of myself as a person. My cat, I believe, does not think of itself as a cat. If it did, then it would be a person. Right? I mean, it would be a certain kind of thing, namely a cat. But it would be a person because persons have self-awareness. So it's not thinking of yourself as a self or whatever. It's having a sense of self-awareness. Second thing, language. Now this is something that I happen to hold, but again it's contentious. I think that language is also or is ultimately what defines us as persons. You can't be a person unless you have a language or are a member of a language community. As I said, contentious. And because having a language puts you in a community of speakers or interpreters, right, to communicate with. So the notion of community comes up here, and it's one I'm going to have to come back to. It's very important. And also, I think that as persons, we see the world in both descriptive and prescriptive terms. Not only do we go around describing the world, or this is that, that's the other, whatever, but we have moral views about things. Well, that shouldn't happen, that should happen. Why are we see animals, as far as I understand, even higher order ones, people argue about elephants, you know, having a moral sense and so on. But it may be a bit, and I don't mind if they're persons, by the way. Let's leave that part out. Most animals don't have moral scruples, right? The lion doesn't think, oh dear, is it the right thing for me to run after that poor deer and jump on it and tear it to pieces and eat it? It doesn't think about that. We are burdened with having to think about that. I'm not quite sure why. I've tried to read about, you know, why. It may just be because we have big enough brains to ask the question, and once having asked the question, we've got to deal with it, right? But anyway, I don't want to say more about that. Okay. As I said a second ago, I am one among others in the world. So, even as I point to myself, this has been a very misleading thing as well. And this goes back to the Cartesian, to the sort of Descartes view that I think in some ways postmodernism was trying to get rid of, this modernist idea that there's a me there, an I, this self, right? David Hume tried to find this self by looking inward. That where is this inner self that's behind all of the qualities and the features that I have? And he couldn't find it, but he kept finding only the qualities. But he didn't look in the right place. I think Kant had a better idea. And so when I talk about the self that I am, I'm not interested in finding some entity, right, that's behind all of those qualities. I'm just talking about being self-aware, or being aware of myself, if you like. So even when I point to myself, what I would want to argue, and I'm going to more or less just assume it, is that in saying this is me, I'm also saying, but I am one among others, you and others, one among other persons. So as I point to myself, I might as well be pointing to you as well. We are bound together in a framework of persons. It makes no sense at all to talk about an isolated individual person that doesn't have any contact or communication with other persons. And that point I want to take both conceptually and practically, right? Factually. Because I think in practice, if you aren't in some kind of community of persons or in mixing with other persons from when you were born, you will not become a person. So there goes the Tarzan concept, right? I mean, according to this idea, it's not possible. And one of the reasons it wouldn't be possible is that you're not going to develop a language. Again, I'm not arguing for that here, but okay, now, language, community, blah, blah, blah. Okay, just let me move on. Now, I do have a principle here which I used before in a book I wrote on identity a couple of years ago, so I'm still drawing on this. It's called the principle of personal worth. The principle of personal worth, let's see, let me read what I've got here. And it underscores the moral primacy of persons and appropriately relegates all these other identity groups, or these groups, nations, religions, races, cultures, roles. We don't need these either for our identities, our literal identities, or for our moral compass. And it's the second claim I think is particularly important and contentious. Insofar as there is a conflict between our moral obligations as persons and our obligations as Australians, Caucasians, parents, members of a culture, blah, 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 the former always takes precedence. If I give up, whether voluntarily or not, being part of such a collective, then I still exist as a person, and as such am both bound and protected by whatever moral framework is deemed appropriate for persons. This is a collection of a rejection of a sort of view called collectivism, and there's a philosophy called communitarianism, which is part of that. And the idea that my existence, I want to say I am one among others. I'm not sure if this seems to be contradictory. I want to say that each of us can see themselves as a person only if they see themselves in relation to other persons. But I also want to say that my being a person morally overrides my being a member of any of those identity groups. It's not the group aspect of it which is important, it's the relationships aspect which is important. So the personhood remains primary. But I'm also rejecting individualism for the same reason, right? The idea, you know, there's an old sort of stereotype that the West, and particularly America, is individualistic, right? And the East, particularly East Asia, is collectivist, you know. All right, and so far as those stereotypes have any value, I'm rejecting both, right, in their extreme forms. So I don't find it very useful to talk about those. Okay, finally, to move on to what I want to talk about. Thank you for coming. Making our way as persons in the world, the role of narrative. Our words and our actions impact on others and on the world. Such phenomena can be described in purely physical terms, right, in a limited form of narrative, so we can see ourselves in a purely physical way. I did this, I do this. It's almost like saying my body does this, right? But that's limited because it views everything in material terms. But at least even at the material level, we could make claims and then evaluate them in terms of truth and falsity. just as science, talking about the natural world, tries to do. I mention that because of something that I skipped over before. I should have pointed out that I think there's a direct link between the postmodernist curse of the idea that truth becomes relative, and there were no facts out there that we can describe properly. There's a direct link between that and what we are seeing at the moment coming out of the mouths of people like Donald Trump, right, who talk about truthiness or false facts, or you know, you can have your facts and I'll have mine. You know, I think it was Groucho Marx who said once, "I've got my principles, but if you don't like them, I've got others." You know, but the idea that really there are no facts, so I might as well make them all up, and you can't call me a liar because there's no such thing as truth anyway. There's a link that, you know, in a sense, that's the just sort of deserts of having the world of literature and, I can't complete that sentence, the contemporary intellectual world has not dealt very cleverly or clearly with the concept of truth. It's given it up too easily because of postmodernism and mistakes about relativism and so on. But again, that's not my major topic. Okay, so, but we want to talk about narrative, or I want to, in a more significant sense, not just describing what's going on. And people like, now these are people I've been quoting even without mentioning it. They are more or less in the communitarian tradition. Some of you will know the names, some may not. Alistair McIntyre, Charles Taylor, Paul Ricoeur. I've been reading some of Ricoeur. He is a continental French philosopher, right? By another one of my former teachers, Pierre Strawson, a very famous analytic philosopher, died a few years ago. He said in one of his last interviews that he finds it very, very sad that his favourite country in the entire world produces the worst philosophy. And he was talking about France, and he would include Ricoeur in that, right? So, I mean, Ricoeur had a Western background as well, but I think it might be just me, but reading some of this material, I mean, philosophy is hard anyway, right? But I can't see what even makes it philosophy half the time. But anyway, Brunner and others, narrative, they would say, is the key to personal identity, unity, and purpose. Now, I'm also interested in this, but the problem is that all of those authors, without exception as far as I can tell, link narrative with defining our identities, right? And I want to say, no, that's a distraction. Our identities are given to us as the minute we come into existence, and you don't need to worry about it. My identity is secure, as long as it's secure in the literal sense, as long as I exist, right? But I still think there's a case to be made for looking at narrative, all right? So, my interest in the potential of narrative to articulate our own responses to what I call the big questions, okay? Constructing our own narratives and helping others construct theirs can allow us to understand the radically different ideas and perspectives that people have, and open up the possibility of bringing these elements into relationship with one another through, for example, empathy, and examining them through dialogue. I'm going to mention an author in a minute who talks a lot about empathy, in particular trying to empathize. She's in the American, she went to a part of America, namely Louisiana, where there were all these Trump supporters and members of the Tea Party and so on, and she desperately tried to get to know them personally and empathize with them, and to really find out what was going on. The problem with the concept of empathy is that, certainly philosophically, it's a very tricky concept to work with. It's not clear what empathy is. I think it's a powerful concept. But if you ask someone intuitively to define empathy, what do you mean when you say you empathize? They will often give you a metaphor. Oh, well, it's when you put yourself in someone else's shoes. And giving a metaphor is great, but if you ask them to unpack that metaphor and say something literal, it's quite difficult. Empathy has both intellectual and emotional or affective characteristics, right? It's powerful, but I think it's also strange and therefore somewhat obscure. Anyway, so I said a minute ago, narratives, telling stories in which we feature, right, necessarily have some kind of descriptive content. I don't believe you can have a narrative in which there is no description. I once asked a group of third grade children a long, long time ago to write a story in which nothing happened. And one kid I remember said something like, what did he say? Something like, there was once a boy named John, the end. And he claimed that was a story with nothing happened. Okay? But I think even there's a bit of description, right? But there are other things going on here in narratives, and I want to just sort of contrast different kinds of narratives. For example, the most obvious thing is that narratives do not have to be true. I mean, you've got great fiction, great narrative fiction, right? So that's one thing, truth, falsity. Does that matter? Well, it might, right? I mean, you don't have to have truth in literature, for example, or you might argue you have to have a sense of consistency or coherence. But the question is, do you have truth or falsity? Do you have a commitment to truth? Or are you simply indifferent to it? Do you have internal consistency or coherence, or are you indifferent to those things as well? Do you, in your narrative, take on a reflective, prescriptive, or moral perspective? So you ask questions not only what did I do or what is going on, but what should be done and was that right or wrong? And do I involve others? This is really crucial because I talked before about the concept of a person is you see yourself as one among others. And some people can give their own narratives if they did them explicitly. Most of us don't, but if we were to, we would tell our own narratives. Some would do it in a very first-person way, or they would mention others only as objects of their convenience. Again, one thinks of someone like Donald Trump, right, who people think of as an out-and-out narcissist of the worst kind. So other people exist only in a sense as objects for his own whatever. Or you might involve others in a very direct way. So your own narrative, in fact, has other authors, because, as some of these writers have said, we contribute to each other's narratives. And is your narrative open to self-correction or self-improvement? This is fundamental, and I have to say why in a couple of minutes. Are you willing to go into your narrative and say, well, I did this, but it was wrong, or I should have done something different? Or you simply dogmatically impose your narrative on others? And connected to that, is your narrative open to dialogical interaction with others, or are you not interested in having a dialogue? Okay, these say the same thing in a different form in a table, and I won't say it again. Quickly, I have these things called quantitative and qualitative failures of deliberation. And I want to talk about deliberation as a certain way of thinking together. To deliberate, engage in dialogue, all these things I regard as similar. Now, quantitative failures is when you have to belong to some kind of group of people. I wanted to say community, but network of others. Call it a community. We nearly all have to, we nearly all do, and indeed I said before, we must see ourselves as one among others. But quantitatively, there may be very few others in your life. And the fewer there are, then the more limited you're going to have, your narrative will be, because it's had input from too few others, okay? But the second feature is more important, what I call qualitative failure. You could be in a community or in a network of thousands, but if they all share the same beliefs, values, and so on that you do, then there's not going to be very much qualitative richness there, right? Because you're all going to support each other, and that's been empirically borne out. That people tend to flock with people who believe what they believe. And as you flock with more of them, you believe, and you reinforce each other's beliefs and values and think, well, you know, this must be right because we all believe this. It's strength in numbers in a moral and qualitative sense, and it's very dangerous. So many people seek cooperation of their views by communicating with others who are likely to share them. Now, how, on the other hand, might we have more qualitative engagement? Well, it's by engaging not just with others, but diverse others, deliberately seeking out those who are likely to have different ideas, different views, and then trying to bridge the two. Okay. Now, I don't know whether you do, I'm sure you'd have to be pretty much living in your office or bedroom without reading or looking at anything if you didn't know that there have been strange things happening in America over the last few years. Now, I'm a bit wary about this because there are strange things happening in many places, right? But America, of course, gets publicity like no other place, which is in some ways part of the problem. But it gets it because it's where a lot of the technology comes from. And also, as I was talking to the Dean earlier, it is still a place where you have the very best of things, including the very best literature, and there's some fantastic books out now about what is going on. But you also have the very worst of things, right, in the same country. It's an amazing place, right? So the concept of the land of the free, this, you know, the crucible of democracy, the American story, right, that came from the revolution and so on and so forth, the idea of exceptionalism, that we are somehow special. This is actually held almost universally in the USA. Appeals for solidarity. I need to find this page because I've got some extra notes here I want to share with you. Okay. solidarity are based on, well, we're all American. It's amazing how many times one can read this. Even someone as noble and respected as Barack Obama would say, and has said when he was in power and even now, look, we have to get over these divisions, you know, that we're all Americans, right? And I want to say, but hang on a minute, that's also part of the problem, because I'm not, right? And the fact what you're saying is that there's this broad concept which is bringing you all together. In one sense, that's true. But in another sense, the meaning that's been attached to being American has, I think, led to trouble. So it's kind of ironic that people want to say we're all Americans. Because with the expectation that the American dream, right, the idea of the American dream is that we can all be rich, powerful, what did I say, and happy. Work hard, get rich, be happy. Now that may also be something that happens in this part of the world as well, but it's particularly, you know, the individual, it's up to the individual, and they can be anything. You know, an idiot can become president, right, and indeed has, right, that's the latest sort of thing you can say in the last few years. When this expectation is not met, which is inevitably not going to be met in a capitalist society, because not everyone is going to get rich, whatever, right, this leads to very high negative emotions. People get resentful, envious, rageful, fearful, grief, all of those things. They feel betrayed, unacknowledged pride, they feel despair. So they look for someone to blame, not themselves, of course. And so what's happened in America recently is that people, a lot of people, not everyone of course, but many have been looking for others to blame, e.g. migrants, minorities, the educated elite, and government itself, not rich businessmen. They're heroes because they've made it, you know. So many see their own narratives, their own deep stories, as one writer called it, in terms of an endless, this is a slightly different thought, I've written it badly. One writer, who I'll mention, her name is Hochschild, has this image of the American dream as a long line. There it is. That's the American dream. You're in line to get to the dream, and it's sort of somewhere here, you know, there. And you're all in line trying to get to this dream, or this, you know, fulfill this dream. It's just that as you're standing here, you notice the line is moving awfully slowly, and sometimes it goes backwards. Why? Because other people are cutting in. Some people are getting in front of us. Look, that black person over there, he's got special treatment. Or that migrant, you know, they're getting special whatever. And that builds up a tremendous amount of resistance, and I think that that's correct. That has been what's happened. I go backwards. So in a sense, I think it's rather ironic that the very idea of the American dream is partly responsible for what it is that's divided people in America. So when leaders say, but we have to remember we're all Americans, I don't think that's actually going to help. Okay, that second paragraph there, the capacity and inclination to think, deliberate, which may not have been very strong in the first place, is suppressed by those kinds of negative emotions. When you feel resentful, angry, you want to blame someone in general, I think it's fairly true that sometimes reason goes out the window. I know that from myself. When I'm in a stressful situation, in a crowded airport or something's not working, suddenly I become this kind of, you know, what's the right way to put it? You know, if I'm in a rage, for example, I lose something in my mind, and later I'm terribly regretful and embarrassed, but at the time I understand that, right? So people do things which are clearly ridiculous and absurd, but because they're driven emotionally. And one of the examples often given about some of these people in the United States, the Trump supporters and so on, are people who have voted against their own interests, right, by voting for someone like Trump. They, for example, will despise, they say we despise government, you know, that tries to control our lives. Meanwhile, they only survive because they get government handouts. Right? There's many examples of this, right? They're so poor, they get government handouts, but despise the government because they feel that they should somehow be independent. There's a lot of those kind of examples, and again, I know I'm speaking in great generalities. Okay, I've said all that. This is coming up. So, see, these are articles just recently, quotes like, we should think of ourselves as Americans first and get away from identity politics. I mean, I think that's a hilarious quote, right? September the 5th. Classic example of identity politics. We should think of ourselves as Americans first, right? Americans, so the real question is, what does it mean to be, oh, sorry, you can't see it. What does it mean to be an American today? Who are we, goddammit? Well, if you have to ask that question, you've got a problem. So I've said that. The concept of populism, which I think you will be familiar with, many people think that populism is a form of democracy, because after all, popular, right? lots of people, right? And democracy requires, you know, the winner is the one who gets the most votes, the popular vote. And so these are some of the features of populism as I see it. First of all, I'm going to make a hypothesis that you can only have populism in a kind of democracy, in its official or what's the word, theoretical democracy. Populism doesn't exist in non-democracies. I'm throwing that out there as a kind of hypothesis. Okay. The suppression of deliberate thought by appeal to emotion, as I just mentioned. Populism often revolves around a symbol, whether it's a person, a nation, or a totem, like the swastika, for example, you know, something which brings people together. And also, conversely, there's often a symbol which people can come together on to hate or fear. The Jew, right, in Nazi Germany was an example. Okay? And there are some examples now around the world, but of course people are very nervous about saying it. You tend to have a narrow focus on issues and alleged conspiracies, and of course you see a very strong emotional divide between us and them. In America at the moment, it is incredibly polarised from everything that one hears. Even the members of same families will just simply not talking to each other. But notwithstanding the reliance of democracy on the popular vote, I claim that democracy and populism are incompatible. That's because I have a view about democracy which is, I don't think, always understood. Democracy is not just about a system where you've got the right to vote and the freedom to vote, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't just bestow rights and privileges, it bestows responsibilities on the people who are going to vote. In particular, the responsibility to think about matters of importance in line with a commitment to truth-telling and the use of reason and so on. When these commitments are absent, the machinery of democracy can bestow power on those who don't respect it. And so, many cases in history where such individuals become demagogues through democracy. Classic example, Hitler, you know, right? He used the democratic system to gain power and then destroy the government. Okay? Trump's rusted on supporters are not deterred by anything he says or does. They're not open to reason or appeals to truth. Now you may think this guy is really very, very one-sided. They do not or cannot display empathy with those on the other side, partly because they don't even acknowledge that they're persons. And of course, some people on the other side return the favour. Now I need to think about drawing to a close, so I want to just, and I haven't said anything really very positive yet, so let's see if I can do so. The author, Hochschild, her name is Ali Russell Hochschild. She's written a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, where she went to Louisiana and stayed there and met people over many, many months and tried to climb what she called the wall of empathy, you know, to try and understand where they were coming from and why they held views which she found repugnant, because she came from California, right? And ditto, vice versa, for them and her. You know, she tried to get them to see where she was coming from. She connects to, indeed immerses herself into the narratives of white working class Americans in a part of Louisiana where they were desperately poor and, you know, they were living on the edges of polluting factories, right? And recognizing on the one hand, yes, look, you know, this is bad, it shouldn't be happening, but then someone will say, well, here was an example she mentioned. The pollution got really bad and it was a Republican government in the state, I think, governor, and he was voted out and a new governor came in claiming to clean things up, and they thought, this is great. He said, however, to clean things up, we need money. So I'm afraid we're going to have an increased taxation. Oh, look at that. These bloody Democrats, right? The first thing they do when they come into power is to raise taxes. That's why we don't vote for them. So that's what those people were saying. So it's a kind of irrationality that comes in when you're not willing or able to think through things for themselves. And of course, we're all capable of doing that. She developed a form of conversation. She developed a conversation with them. So in a sense, she entered into their narratives, not by agreeing with them. That's important to say that, but by trying to build a sense of trust and empathy. And she became friends with a number of them. She calls it, people have their deep stories. The people there had their deep stories as well, and she got to know what those stories are. And I'm interested in the idea of people being encouraged to tell their deep stories, but then to look at their own deep stories, to share them, and to look at ways in which we might build on them, okay? To stand back from what I'm calling, rather rudely, their impoverished narratives, in order to see what I'm calling a broader picture. There's an important clue here as to how the judicious use of narrative can overcome populism. But again, I'm going to just jump now. The concept of dialogue can be brought in here. I've written and talked about dialogue for many years. It's at the very heart of philosophy for children. The idea that children from a young age can be in dialogue with each other if you give them certain motivation and encouragement. And dialogue is many ways to define it. It's a form of thinking out loud. I think it has these features, the way I thought about it. It's driven by a desire to resolve or understand something unknown or puzzling. There's got to be something we don't have and we want it, otherwise there's no point in having a dialogue. Dialogue also has a logic or coherence. It's not just completely random. Now, narrative is structured by time and causality. You tell a story, mainly it's a narrative in terms of its time, through time. But dialogue, I think, has a logic as well as anything else. Dialogue has to be self-correcting. Otherwise, it's not a dialogue. In a true dialogue, people must be willing to say, and not only say, to do, I might be mistaken here. It's very easy to say it, but I have to do it. Dialogue invites diverse voices and viewpoints as input to inquiry. So just as many have said about science, a good scientist actively seeks people to disagree with him or experiments that will falsify his or her theories. It's a very great thing to do, and you might feel somewhat self-destructive, but that's how you build knowledge, by making the error and then moving on. Dialogue doesn't privilege any one voice and involves normative judgment, which I'm not going to say too much more about. Just as narrative, now you can have a narrative in which you have elements of dialogue. Mark, 2 more minutes. And in the philosophy for children stories, for example, as LCM would know, there's a sort of a narrative, not a great one, but it's got a dialogical structure built into it, although many narratives don't. And I do indeed, this is something fairly new in my thinking, that dialogue becomes more urgent and more meaningful when it's embedded in a narrative context. So the context indicates an ownership, since narrative must be of someone and constructed by someone. And it provides ground for what is claimed to be true. This is a logical point. People who do any kind of logic will realize that logic by itself cannot give you the truth. It only allows you to make rational moves from one thing to another. If you start off with something that's true, good logic will guarantee it will remain true. But if you start off with something that's false, that's not logic's fault. You can have all the best reasoning in the world, but you'll still end up with things that are false. But narrative, on the other hand, if you keep your eyes up, you can guarantee or try to make sure that it's true. So here's the idea that narrative and dialogue have a sort of overlap. But then the question is, how can we conjoin, personal narratives and dialogue? And I'm only really at the beginning of thinking about this. Here's a little diagram. I'm so proud of this. It took me so long to do, because I don't really understand PowerPoint very well. But this is what Hochschild talked about. There's a wall between, especially these groups in the US, but you see it elsewhere as well. The us and the them, right? Now, the idea would be to try to get rid of that wall by bringing people together, linking narratives, developing a sense of empathy, but notice that there's coming together in your own group, and then there's the idea of coming together with the other group. And that's going to be much harder. You first of all have to acknowledge that they are persons, right? And then try and find ways to talk to them. And finally to end up in dialogue. I don't have time to talk more about that. I'm not going to have time to talk about that either. It was an example where young people were brought together with very different backgrounds, and it turned out they could talk to each other. And finally, a topic on which I wish we had another hour at least, what's happening in a country like China, or in China, which is a non-democratic society? What is the possibility for people to be able to tell the kind of narratives that might turn into dialogue, right? And of course the problem here, or one of them, is that there's already an official narrative, right, the government's narrative, that is not allowed to be criticised. And there's a problem there. What are the and I'm just going to ask these questions. What are the possibilities for public engagement in civic life which involve the government as well as the people? For me, that's more important than having a vote. I mean, okay, you might think voting is important, have a democracy, able to throw people out of this. But even more important, I think, is if you're going to have someone there for life, then be open to conversation, discussion, change, correction, and so on. And I'm asking the question whether that is something that is happening in a place like China. You need to have a safe place, just like in the classroom. You need a safe civic society so that people can stand up and say, we don't think this should happen, right? And you need the willingness of those in authority to self-correct. And I suppose I'm asking, is this possible? Now, I guess the obvious problem is I'm not really talking about today, but if you start this early with young people, you've got a better chance. But of course the problem with that point, which applies very much in a country like America and probably China as well, is that the education system is largely controlled by the government. So if the government, I mean the Republican Party in the last 50 or X more years in America has, according to some views, deliberately impoverished the public education system so that you're not going to have the problem of kids growing up as thinkers who are then going to criticize them. And that's terrible if it's true, right? But I mean, there is something in that. In Australia, I don't think we would say the same thing. China, well, you have to think about that as a question. When the government controls what happens in education, how realistic is it for someone to say that we need to have, good critical, self-corrective thinking in education? Okay, I got some more quotes, which I'm not going to have time to talk about, but things coming from China, and there's more every day. There's a bit of a focus on things at the moment. Ministers who will not allow textbooks that have got any criticism, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I'm not going to talk about it because of the time. This slide was about Australia and the idea that there are some Chinese students who seem to be spying for China inside Australia. So anyway, excuse me. I'll finish with one thing which may seem a bit disconnected, but it goes back to my earlier idea. I'm interested now in the concept of community. I mean, I've always been interested in community, but I'm interested in the different kinds of communities, because on the one hand, for example, in philosophy of children, we have this idea of a community of inquiry, a community of thinkers, which of course is not brand new, but and this is the good end of things, right? People who come together, they've got something to share, but they talk to each other, and they're willing to listen and to share, but to also self-correct, to hear what others have got to say and to change their minds. On the other hand, you have many other kinds of communities, and there is a tendency, the historian writer, I don't know what it was, Alexis de Tocqueville, in the 19th century went to America and wrote a book, I think, called Democracy in America. And he said one of the things he found about America compared to Europe is the propensity of people to form communities. They get together at every possible opportunity in little groups and do all sorts of things. And I thought for a long time he was giving that as a commendation, as something positive. And there is something nice about it, right? You spend time with all the others. But recently I heard a report that pointed out, and I don't know whether he said this or someone else, that actually there's a danger, there's a sting in the tail. And that is that the community can become rigid and ossified. And like I said before, it ends up just reinforcing its own beliefs, right? So it builds up a wall between itself and others. Now, if it's a book club, right, or a tennis club or something, no big deal. But when it gets political, and of course political communities and political groups are absolutely expert at not taking on board what they don't want to take on board, and not really being willing to self-correct. So the idea of community, I think, is a bit of a mixed blessing, and I'm very interested in exploring this further. Okay, the end. Very much, sorry, I know we